Hey, Scott here. I want to walk you through the basics of record label royalties. Royalties seems kind of intimidating because if you get it wrong, that's a big problem. And so it is kind of intimidating, but it's not that complicated. And that's what I'm going to walk you through as fast as I can on today's episode. A big shout out to my friends at Hellbender Vinyl. Speaking of accounting, there's so many parts of running a record label. Yes, there's the accounting, but a fun part is the manufacturing where you actually get to hold a record in your hand. And so if you're ever thinking about pressing vinyl, make sure you check out our sponsor, Hellbender Vinyl, and reach out to them to press your next vinyl project. Just go to hellbendervinyl.com. Okay, so let's ask this first question. How do we get a royalty? Like, meaning, what do we actually pay the artist? How do we come up with that number? So I will use my friends Infinite Catalog. Infinite Catalog are a company that creates a software that helps you manage your record label's royalties. We've talked with them on the podcast over the years, on the YouTube channel. We've also had them teach in our Label Mates group. Here's a very simple formula that they use. You take your income, you minus your expenses, then you multiply it by the artist share, which means whatever cut that they get, so 50% or 100% or 10%, you multiply by that number, and what you're left with is your royalty. So it's income, so that means all the money that comes in from Spotify and Bandcamp and everything else, minus the expenses. So if you spent any money on ad dollars or manufacturing or hiring a publicist or a photographer, you subtract that, then whatever you're left over, we call that the profit or the net. That money is what you share with the artists. And so if their royalty rate is 50%, that's how much they're supposed to get of the net profits. Then you multiply that number by 0.50, which gives you half of that number. So let's say a record made $1,000 and it cost $500 to promote that record. You're left with $500. And if the label gets 50% and the artist gets 50%, that $500, $250 goes to you, the label, and $250 goes to the artist. Pretty simple. To add a little bit of confusion to that, though, is if the label has paid the artist in advance, then you would subtract that advance before you give them their royalties. So let's go back to that number. $1,000 the record made, it costs $500 to make, so you're left over with $500, $250 to the artist and $250 to the label. But if the label gave an advance of $250 to the artist already, then the label doesn't actually have to pay them anything in that equation. The label takes $250, the label keeps the other $250 as kind of a reimbursement for the advance they already paid. Okay, I'm getting a little bit crazy here. So I want to talk about some terminology. So let's talk about the term income. So that was the first part of that equation. Income, like I said, means the money that Spotify pays you or your digital distributor, the money you make from selling vinyl or cassettes or CDs on Bandcamp or digital downloads. If you sell t-shirts of the artist on your website, even things like sync licensing fees or any type of money that you make related to that one release or related to that one artist. So the money you make is called income. Expenses can be anything, like I mentioned, from a photographer to a mastering engineer to Facebook ads or Google ads, or maybe you paid a director to do a music video. Again, the expenses have to be related to that specific release or that specific artist. So your internet connection in your record label's office is not the expense of an artist. But if you pay Squarespace for a website for that artist, then that is an expense. But the expense of your own record label's website is not an expense for that artist. Like I mentioned, advances are money that you pay to the artist in advance. This was traditionally done as a way for a record label to sign an artist and say, okay, here's a big chunk of money for you to pay your rent, to live off of, and to pay for a producer and studio time so that ideally you come back a year from now with a completed record. We don't see that too much anymore, but a record label might want to give an artist $500 or $1,000 just as a show of good faith, to say, I believe in you and hopefully this will help with, maybe they want to buy something to go on tour or whatever. And sometimes it's just a nominal fee. And I know some labels in our community that do $10,000 as like a show of commitment. Sometimes it's just $1,000. Sometimes the artist says, I don't want an advance. What's $500 going to do? I'd rather that get put towards promoting my record. Profit, like already mentioned, is all of the money you make minus the expenses. Whatever is left over is your profit. It's also sometimes referred to as your net. Maybe because it's like whatever you catch, whatever is left over. Maybe, I don't know. You can't really say that making $10,000 on an album is profit if the album cost you $9,000 to make, because you kind of have to pay back those expenses. So in that equation, $1,000 would be your profit. The term artist share or artist percentage or splits refers to your contract with that artist. And so the majority of record labels I speak to have a 50-50 share with their artists, but specifically a 50-50 profit share, meaning whatever's left over after the expenses have been paid is what they split with the artist. And in most cases, it's 50-50. Traditionally, major record labels were 80 or 90% that they would keep for themselves, and the artist would get a 5 to 10% royalty. Independent record labels are moving more towards 50-50. I think it's a really empathetic decision. I think it's a really fair decision. I think it's great when both people have the same share in the company being the artist, the same share, the same investment, the same skin in the game. I think if it tips in anyone's direction, I'm not sure. And the people I've talked to, I just don't think it works that way. However, I've known some labels who will say, I'd rather give more to the artist because they're trying to be generous. In a lot of cases, and this was me when I was getting started, I wasn't necessarily just being generous. I had the imposter syndrome. I didn't think that I deserved to take more than, let's say, 30 or 35% from the artist. And so I gave more to the artist. But down the road, that became a problem because I couldn't prioritize them over my own music or other things in my life because I wasn't making that much money from them. And so it's almost like if I had taken more from them, I would have worked harder to promote that record. So that's why I feel like 50-50 makes a lot of sense. One thing I want to help you with before I let you go is the question of when do you make these calculations, or how often should you be paying your artists a royalty? There really is no rule. There's no industry standard rule. However, I would say the majority of people use the quarterly calendar. So the first quarter is January, February, March. Every 3 months, start to calculate the royalties for the past 3 months. Now, when you release a new album, and make sure an artist knows this, you won't get paid for the streams of that album for a couple of months. So it may not even come in the first quarter. So they may have released a record in January, and by the time you're doing their royalty reports on April 1st, you don't even have all of the revenue come in yet from that new album. So they might be confused by that, but that's okay. You're still doing the royalties based on everything that you've received in those 3 months. And so quarterly is the most common. Some people do yearly. That's a problem because the artist doesn't get any information or any money from you at all. It also means that you're hoarding all of this money for an entire year, and you have to make sure you keep that in a separate account and don't spend it because it belongs to your artist. So that's a problem. Semi-annual is what, every 6 months? That's okay. One of the things my friend Hunter says at Infinite Catalog is the longer you go in between calculating these royalties, the more likely it is that you're going to procrastinate on doing it because you kind of forget how it was done. Every time you have to open up your books and open up all of your income sources, you're like, where do I get that from? How do I convert that again? I'm guilty of this all the time. So that's why quarterly is a little bit more manageable, because it's like, I just did this 3 months ago. I remember where to get this from. But then again, you only have to do it 4 times a year. If you're doing it 12 times a year or every other month at 6 times a year, that's still maybe just a little bit too much. Monthly doesn't make sense because there really isn't that much money coming in on a monthly basis for every artist for it to make sense. So every other quarterly, I think that makes a lot of sense. The most important thing is to be transparent. Everything we've talked about today, once you figure it out or you understand how it works, then bring your artist into this as well. Let them watch this video so that they know how it all works. Be as transparent as possible. If you use a software like Infinite Catalog, you can actually give them their own account for them to log in and to see how well they're doing, how much money they made the previous month. Even if they're not getting statements or payments from you, they can still log in at any time and kind of get a status report of how things are going for them financially. If you don't use Infinite Catalog or you don't use another tool like it, then give them screenshots or have them over to your label office and show them around and say, this is how things are going. Make sure you're very upfront with them. Make sure you have this percentage and this formula that I talked about at the beginning of this episode. Make sure you have that in the contract so that they know what to expect. Make sure they know that they're only going to get a royalty check every 3 months or whatever you choose. I hope you found this helpful. Go to otherrecordlabels.com/royalties. That's where I keep all of my resources, as well as some free templates and other cool things that will help you in your record label royalty journey. Thanks again to our sponsor, Hellbender Vinyl, for sponsoring today's episode. Thanks for watching.